I am Genevieve, 35 years old, and today I buried my husband, Prescott, on the other side of the world. After 32 sleepless hours of travel, I texted our family group chat. Flight lands at 5 p.m. Can someone pick me up? My brother Sebastian replied, "We're busy. Try a cab." My mother Margaret added, "Why didn't you plan better?" With trembling fingers I typed, "No worries," while silently collapsing inside. I had no idea that within a single day my family's cruelty would be broadcast on the evening news for the whole city of Hawthorne Bay to see. Before grief rewrote my entire existence, I had what most people would call a picture-perfect life. Prescott and I met in a university lecture hall when he tipped an entire cup of coffee onto my economics textbook. Mortified, he bought me a new textbook and somehow turned the disaster into a dinner date. We married after graduation and built a cozy 2-story home in Hawthorne Bay, complete with a garden I fussed over every spring. Prescott liked to joke that my tomatoes could win a ribbon at the county fair if I ever worked up the nerve to enter them. I never did, mostly because I was terrified of Mrs. Doyle, our neighborhood's reigning 3-time champion, who guarded her title like a dragon guards gold. 10 years passed like a good dream. I worked as a marketing director. Prescott thrived as a software engineer. We had Thursday game nights with friends, we traveled when we could, and we'd converted our spare room into an office that we joked would graduate into a nursery someday. Then came the offer. A 7-month contract with Solen Technologies, based on the island nation of Meridian Isle. It was the opportunity of a lifetime. I arranged to work remotely for part of it, and we planned to split our time between continents. The night before he left, we had a candlelit dinner at home, and Prescott squeezed my hand and promised, 7 months will fly by. Then we start the next chapter. We video called daily for the first 2 months. I flew out for 3 weeks around the holidays, and it felt like a second honeymoon, until it wasn't. I was back home when Prescott complained of a splitting headache during our morning call. "Probably stress," he said, rubbing his temples. "Big deadline." 8 hours later, his coworker called from his phone. Prescott had collapsed in a meeting. I booked the first flight out, but by the time I landed 28 hours later, he was already in a coma. Brain aneurysm. Emergency surgery. Catastrophic damage. For 6 days I sat beside his hospital bed, holding his hand, begging for a miracle that never came. Prescott was 37. Navigating a foreign hospital system alone, with grief fogging every translated form, was its own special nightmare. I called home daily, desperate for comfort. My mother asked if I'd remembered to buy travel insurance. Sebastian suggested I just hire someone local to handle it so I could fly home sooner. I couldn't leave Prescott in a country where he knew no one but co-workers. So I stayed and did it all myself. The death certificate paperwork alone took 3 full days of office visits. Because flying his body home was prohibitively expensive, I arranged a small burial in Meridian Isle. A handful of his co-workers, a few expat friends he'd made, and me. No family. My parents said the last-minute flights cost too much. Sebastian had critical work obligations. I stood alone as they lowered my husband into unfamiliar soil. Looking back, I shouldn't have been surprised. This was simply how my family operated. When I graduated as valedictorian, my parents left right after my speech to get Sebastian to his baseball game. At my wedding, my mother spent more time fretting over Sebastian's on-again off-again girlfriend, Priscilla, than she did congratulating me. I had spent a lifetime making excuses for them, telling myself that family just shows love differently. Standing at my husband's grave, 12 time zones from home, I finally understood. Some people simply don't have the capacity to put anyone else first, even when it costs them nothing but a little inconvenience. My journey home stretched over 32 grueling hours. A mechanical delay in Meridian Isle, a missed connection that stranded me overnight in an airport hotel, and a final flight so turbulent the crew stayed buckled in for 2 hours straight. I spent that stretch gripping my armrest and reciting the alphabet backwards, a trick Prescott always used to calm me down. It worked embarrassingly well, even without him there to laugh at me for it. Somewhere over the ocean, 30,000 feet up and running on nothing but crackers and willpower, I finally let myself remember all the small cruelties I'd spent years excusing. The broken arm at 8 years old when I was left with a neighbor so my parents could watch Sebastian's championship game. The scholarship they only asked about in terms of cost. The wedding my father complained was too expensive while Sebastian strolled in an hour late. 3 days before that final flight, I'd sent our itinerary to the family chat. The replies were 2 thumbs-up emojis and a question from Sebastian about souvenirs. Nobody offered to meet me. And then, touching down on home soil after burying the love of my life alone. We're busy. Try a cab. Why didn't you plan better? Sitting in my cramped seat, surrounded by strangers eager to disembark, I made myself a silent promise. This was the last time I would lower a bucket into an empty well. Hawthorne Bay International buzzed with the ordinary chaos of a Tuesday evening while I moved through it like a ghost. At baggage claim, I watched my 3 suitcases circle the belt. One of my own things, 2 crammed with everything of Prescott's I couldn't bear to leave behind. His favorite sweater, the leather journal I'd given him, his coffee mug, fragments of a life that now only existed in fragments. My phone buzzed with a group chat again. I opened it hoping someone had reconsidered. Sebastian. Seriously sis, we can't rearrange our whole schedule last minute. This is why planning exists. Margaret. Your father and I have dinner with the Kingsleys tonight. We're VP'd weeks ago. Edmund. Forecast says rain later. Drive carefully. Not one question about how I was doing. I typed, no worries, I understand. Though I understood nothing at all. Hauling the luggage cart toward the exit, a wheel jammed and sent the top suitcase crashing open, spilling Prescott's clothes across the polished floor. I dropped to my knees, grabbing at his blue sweater, his running shoes, the tie he wore to fancy dinners, each item detonating a fresh wave of grief. Let me help you, ma'am. An airport employee named Josephine knelt beside me, kind-eyed, gently gathering his things. Are you all right? It had been so long since anyone asked me that plainly. My husband died, I whispered. I just buried him overseas. Josephine's face softened. She repacked my suitcase, walked me to the rideshare line, waited until my car arrived and squeezed my hand. Take care of yourself, she said. More comfort than my own family had managed in a week. The ride cost $95 thanks to surge pricing. My driver, a cheerful older man named Bernard, made gentle small talk and, sensing my silence needed protecting, just turned on soft jazz and pointed out changes to the skyline instead. When we reached my driveway, the house looked exactly the same and completely different. Prescott would never again open that door, never again grumble about the maple tree clogging the gutters. Inside was cold and dark. My mother had promised to adjust the thermostat and clearly forgotten. Mail spilled from the basket. The fridge held nothing but expired condiments, despite Sebastian's promise to stock it. Too exhausted to fight it, I curled up in the armchair in our bedroom, unable to face our bed, and finally broke down completely. I woke hours later, shivering to a strange gurgling sound. I stumbled downstairs and flipped on the kitchen light to find water gushing from a crack in the ceiling, pooling ankle-deep across the tile. A pipe had frozen and burst, the inevitable result of a house nobody had bothered to heat. I sloshed through icy water to the utility closet, burned my fingers wrenching the frozen shutoff valve closed, and surveyed the damage. Buckled floors, sagging drywall, water dripping ominously near the light fixtures. The emergency plumber I called laughed grimly. Earliest we've got is Tuesday. Storms got everybody's pipes bursting. My call to Sebastian went about as well as expected. He was getting ready for a dinner with the Carltons, important clients he'd been courting for months, and his and Priscilla's guest room was, apparently, buried under her scrapbooking supplies. My parents cited Bridge Club and Edmund's bad back. What about a hotel? My mother suggested. You should have insurance for that. By then I hadn't eaten properly in over a day. Nauseated and lightheaded, I found a sleeve of stale crackers and ate them mechanically, standing in water that had soaked through my shoes. In a last foolish attempt to get some heat working, I went down to check the basement electrical panel, flashlight in hand, ankle-deep in floodwater. My foot slipped on the wet concrete. My hand shot out and hit the panel. A jolt of electricity threw me backward. My head cracked against something hard, and the world went dark for a moment. I came to on the basement floor, my right arm tingling, blood trickling from a gash above my eyebrow. Dizzy and disoriented, I dragged myself back upstairs and collapsed onto the living room sofa, unable to go any further. The house kept growing colder. My fingers and toes went numb. Then, through the fog, a high, shrill beeping. The carbon monoxide detector, warning of a heating system compromised by the flood. Carbon monoxide is colorless, odorless, and utterly silent about how dangerous it is, which is precisely why every home is supposed to have a working detector, and precisely why mine, thankfully, did. My phone sat inches away on the coffee table, useless as the moon. As darkness swallowed the edges of my vision, I thought, almost peacefully, that if this was the end, at least I'd be with Prescott again. The last thing I remember was someone pounding on the front door. My neighbor, Dorothy, had spotted water flowing out from under my porch. When no one answered her knock but she heard the alarm screaming inside, she called emergency services immediately. Firefighters broke the door down and found me unconscious, the house dangerously cold, carbon monoxide levels well past the safety threshold. A few more hours, one paramedic reportedly told the ER doctor, and this would have had a very different ending. At Hawthorne Bay General, the medical team worked to warm my body, pump oxygen through my system, stitch the gash on my temple, and monitor my heart for damage from the shock. A nurse named Harriet noticed my passport, still stamped from Meridian Isle, and my wedding ring, and gently asked about my situation. In my half-conscious state, I told her everything, and she documented it all, worried about the support system I so clearly didn't have. What neither of us knew was that a local reporter, Jonathan Reed, was at the hospital covering storm-related injuries and overheard paramedics discussing my case in the break room. He interviewed Dorothy, who admitted through tears that she'd meant to check on me sooner. He spoke to the paramedics, one of whom, visibly shaken, described the family group chat still glowing on my phone when they found me. A widow asking for a ride from the airport told to try a cab. By that evening, the story hit the news. Local woman returns from husband's overseas funeral to near tragedy. Screenshots of the chat spread across community pages and then further. The hashtag no worries began trending locally. And this time my family wasn't the audience. They were the headline. That night, as the story aired, my family arrived at the hospital to find their private cruelty had gone very public. Sebastian burst in first, ashen. "We just saw the news. They're making it sound like we abandoned you." My mother arrived already defensive, telling the nurse it was a complete misrepresentation before even looking at me. My father said nothing, only lingered by the door and once the nurse stepped out quietly asked, "Are you going to be okay?" The first real question any of them had asked me since Prescott died. Within minutes, my phone was flooded with calls from relatives who'd seen the report. Aunt Beatrice rang my mother directly, demanding to know why nobody had gone to the airport. In the hallway, I could hear my family arguing in hushed, panicked voices. Not about me but about their reputations. Sebastian worried about his clients. My mother worried about her bridge club. My father proposed simply moving me into their house, to show everyone we care. Appearances, damage control, and their own discomfort. Never once genuine concern. Meanwhile, actual kindness poured in from strangers. A plumbing company offered to fix my pipes for free, a restoration service offered to repair the flood damage at no cost, a hotel chain offered a complimentary stay, and the hospital social worker, Miss Fairweather, arrived with a folder listing options. A 2-week hotel stay, meal delivery, transportation to appointments, and a grief support group that met twice a week. "You have options," she told me. "You don't have to go with your family if that isn't what you want." It was the first time anyone had told me I had a choice. The next morning, my family had clearly rehearsed a performance of devotion for the doctor. "Of course our family sticks together," my mother said sweetly, touching my arm. Dr. Whitfield, unmoved, asked directly, "What support system do you have, Genevieve?" When my mother answered for me, a nurse named Penelope, checking my vitals, quietly asked instead, "Are you comfortable with this plan? Because there are alternatives." My mother stiffened. Alternatives? She's coming home with family where she belongs. Penelope simply met my eyes. "The choice is yours." And for the first time in my life I chose. "I would like to hear about the alternatives," I said, my voice steadier than it had been in weeks. In the stunned silence that followed, I finally said out loud everything I'd swallowed for 35 years. That when Prescott was dying they were too busy, that they'd called the flights too expensive, that they'd suggested a cab after I buried my husband alone, that they'd prioritized dinner parties over a flooded, freezing house. "You didn't need to see me on the news to know I was grieving and alone," I told them. "You chose not to see it." My mother called my expectations unrealistic. Sebastian insisted they couldn't be expected to remember every little detail. I looked at him and said quietly, "Like whether your newly widowed sister might freeze to death in her own home." They left in a huff, my mother promising they wouldn't drop everything for me again. "That's exactly my point," I told her. "I never could expect that. And now I no longer will." I spent the next 2 weeks in a warm hotel suite overlooking the river, surrounded by the unglamorous, unconditional kindness of near strangers. Dorothy brought homemade soup every Sunday. 2 neighbors, Frederick and Oswald, helped rebuild my garden beds. A retired schoolteacher named Constance simply sat with me on the hardest days, saying nothing at all, which somehow said everything. My house, meanwhile, got a second life. A smart thermostat, a new water heater, reinforced plumbing that would never freeze again. What began as destruction became renovation, in more ways than one. 6 months after Prescott's death, I used his life insurance to establish the Prescott Ashworth Memorial Scholarship for International Education, funding students who wanted to study abroad, with a built-in emergency travel fund for their families, so that no one would ever again face what I faced alone in a foreign hospital. On what would have been our 11th anniversary, I awarded the first scholarship to a bright-eyed junior named Matilda, headed to study in Meridian Isle herself. My family sent their regrets. A week later, an actual handwritten letter arrived from my father, the first of my life. He wrote that he recognized their failure, not just in practical things like airport rides, but in the deeper obligation to show up when it mattered. "The man you married would be proud of the woman you've become," he wrote. "Perhaps someday we might find a way forward, not as we were, but as we could be." I didn't respond right away. When I finally did, I set clear terms. Occasional lunches, just the 2 of us, no expectation of holidays or family gatherings. He agreed. Our first lunch was stiff. Our third found something like an honest rhythm. It wasn't the closeness I'd once hoped for, but it was real, which was more than we'd ever had before. My mother and Sebastian kept their distance. The occasional impersonal card, the only proof they remembered I existed. I let that be their choice and stopped spending myself on relationships that only ever took. A year after Prescott died, I flew back to Meridian Isle alone, to visit his grave on the anniversary. Watching families reunite around me at the gate, I felt the old ache, but not the old desperation. I had learned the hardest possible way, that family can be built as much as it can be born into. That boundaries aren't walls but filters, letting the good in while keeping the harm out. And that my worth was never something that depended on anyone else's willingness to see it. If you have ever felt abandoned by the people who were supposed to show up for you, please hear this. It was never a measure of your value, only of their limits. Stay open to the unexpected kindness of strangers, even when your history makes that feel dangerous. Sometimes the people who become your family are the ones who simply show up, again and again, when showing up is hardest.